The 73-year-old grandmother from Ohio froze mid-step, her weathered hand clutching a water bottle as she stared at the massive African lion trapped 20 feet away. Jake Morrison's military training kicked in instantly. "Ma'am, get back now!" But Maggie Sullivan didn't move. The steel trap had clamped down on the lion's hind leg 3 days ago, and 5 lionesses formed a perfect protective circle around their dying king, their amber eyes locked on the elderly woman who dared to approach. This wasn't supposed to happen. Tourists stay in vehicles, predators attack intruders, and grandmothers from Dayton don't walk toward 400-pound carnivores. Sarah Chen Williams gasped, her safari guide training screaming danger, while Tommy Mackenzie's camera clicked frantically, capturing the impossible scene. The lion's labored breathing echoed across the Masai Mara as Maggie whispered, "Easy now, big boy. I know what it's like to hurt alone." Jake's radio crackled with desperate calls for backup, his hands trembling against his rifle. What force could make a dying lion trust a stranger? And why wouldn't those lionesses attack? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 3 days earlier, Maggie Sullivan had stepped off the dusty Land Cruiser at Wilson Airport in Nairobi, clutching a worn leather purse and a small wooden box that contained everything left of her 51-year marriage. At 73, with silver hair pulled back in a practical bun and reading glasses hanging from a beaded chain, she looked like any other American retiree fulfilling a bucket list dream. But Harold's ashes weren't the only secret she carried. The early-stage dementia diagnosis folded in her wallet remained hidden from her 4 children back in Dayton. "Well, I'll be blessed," she'd whispered, watching giraffes graze against the acacia trees. Harold was right about this place. The $23,000 from his life insurance policy had been meant to last 5 years in assisted living. Instead, she'd spent it all on this final pilgrimage to fulfill a promise made in 1970, when young Harold had proposed on these very plains as a wildlife researcher. Jake Morrison watched the elderly tourist with practiced skepticism. At 45, the former Marine had seen enough grief-stricken Americans seeking meaning in Africa's wilderness. 3 tours in Afghanistan had left him with a purple heart, recurring nightmares about his best friend Jimmy Kowalski dying in Kandahar, and a desperate need to protect something, anything, that couldn't shoot back. 8 years guiding safaris in the Masai Mara had become his therapy, though the monthly calls from his ex-wife about their daughter Emma's college fund reminded him that healing came with a price. His calloused hands, steady enough to handle wounded lions, still shook when helicopters passed overhead. Sarah Chen Williams studied the group dynamics with the trained eye of a former marriage counselor. Half Chinese, half Irish, she'd fled San Francisco 2 years ago after losing custody of 16-year-old Michael to her wealthy ex-husband. The messy divorce had shattered her faith in lasting love, but something about Maggie's quiet determination stirred memories of the maternal instincts she thought she'd buried. Her fluent Swahili and passion for wildlife conservation had earned respect among the Maasai guides, though they couldn't heal the guilt that gnawed at her. Had she really put her career before her son? Tommy Big Mike Mackenzie adjusted his telephoto lens with hands that had captured 3 decades of National Geographic's most powerful images. The burly photographer from Montana carried his recent heart disease diagnosis like a secret weight, knowing this Kenya assignment would be his final project before forced retirement. His wife's death from cancer had left him hollow, filling the emptiness with increasingly dangerous shoots. The irony wasn't lost on him. A man who documented life across 6 continents was running out of time to live his own. As their convoy headed into the reserve that August morning, none of them suspected that within hours they'd become the center of a viral story that would redefine everything they thought they knew about courage, family, and the bonds that transcend species. The golden grasslands stretched endlessly under the African sun, hiding both ancient wisdom and modern tragedy in its shadows. The first golden rays of dawn painted the Masai Mara in shades of amber as their convoy rumbled across the vast grasslands. Maggie pressed her face against the window, watching zebras scatter like living confetti across the plains. "Harold always said this was God's country," she murmured, pulling out a faded photograph of a young man with kind eyes standing beside an acacia tree. "We promised we'd come back together when we retired." Her voice carried the weight of dreams deferred too long. Jake navigated the rough terrain with military precision, his trained eyes scanning for potential threats, while half listening to Maggie's stories about her late husband's conservation work in the 1970s. Something about her quiet resolve reminded him of his own grandmother, who'd raised him after his parents died. But when Maggie suddenly called him Harold while pointing at a herd of elephants, Jake exchanged worried glances with Sarah in the rearview mirror. The old woman's occasional confusion was becoming harder to ignore. "There," Tommy whispered urgently, lowering his massive telephoto lens. 2 o'clock, about 300 yards. Through the viewfinder, he'd spotted something that made his photographer's instincts scream danger. A massive pride of lions lounged beneath a cluster of fever trees, but their behavior was all wrong. Instead of the lazy contentment typical of morning hours, tension radiated from every muscle. Sarah grabbed her binoculars, her breath catching as the scene came into focus. "That's not normal," she said, her marriage counselor training recognizing dysfunction even in animal behavior. 6 lions together isn't unusual, but look at the females. They're agitated, circling. The 5 lionesses paced restlessly around their male, whose magnificent golden mane caught the early light. Jake's military experience kicked in as he assessed the situation through his scope. What he saw made his stomach clench with familiar dread, the same feeling he'd had in Afghanistan when something was terribly wrong but not yet visible. The alpha male lion was favoring his left rear leg, moving with the careful gait of someone in severe pain. "Son of a bitch," he muttered, adjusting the focus. "That's a steel trap." The massive device clamped around the lion's leg gleamed with the cold efficiency of military hardware. Jake had seen similar traps in war zones, designed to stop vehicles or maim soldiers. This one was meant for elephants or rhinos, its serrated teeth buried deep in muscle and bone. Blood had crusted around the metal, and the lion's leg was grotesquely swollen. "Oh, dear God," Maggie gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. For a moment, her confusion cleared completely, replaced by the same maternal instinct that had guided her through 40 years of teaching elementary school. "That poor creature is suffering." Her voice carried the authority of someone who'd spent decades comforting frightened children, and something in her tone made even Jake pause. Sarah was already calculating logistics, her mind racing through possibilities. "The nearest Kenya Wildlife Service station is 4 hours away. By the time we get help and return—" She didn't finish the sentence, but everyone understood. The lion's labored breathing was visible even from this distance, and the way the 5 females refused to leave his side spoke to bonds deeper than survival instinct. Tommy's camera clicked rapidly as he documented the scene, his professional detachment warring with unexpected emotion. In 30 years of wildlife photography, he'd witnessed nature's cruelty countless times, but something about this moment felt different. The lion's eyes held an intelligence that seemed almost human, and the loyalty of the females reminded him painfully of his wife's devotion during her final battle with cancer. "We have to try the radio," Jake said, reaching for the satellite communication device. But when he powered it up, only static emerged. He tried different frequencies, adjusting the antenna with growing frustration. "This doesn't make sense. The equipment was working fine yesterday." Unknown to the group, their communications were being jammed by someone who had very specific reasons for wanting them isolated. Maggie surprised everyone by climbing out of the vehicle before Jake could stop her. "In my day, we didn't leave family behind," she said firmly, her momentary clarity giving her words surprising strength. The other three scrambled after her, Jake's protective instincts overriding protocol as he positioned himself between Maggie and potential danger. As they approached on foot, the scene became even more heartbreaking. The lion's breathing was shallow and rapid, his magnificent head resting on the ground in exhaustion. The trap had been there for days, judging by the dried blood and the infected tissue around the metal teeth. But most remarkably, when the 5 lionesses noticed the humans approaching, they didn't attack. Instead, they formed a defensive circle, their amber eyes watchful but not aggressive, as if recognizing potential allies rather than threats. "This changes everything," Sarah whispered, watching the extraordinary display of trust. In that moment, 4 strangers from different worlds realized they were about to become part of something larger than themselves. A story that would test every assumption they held about courage, loyalty, and the invisible threads that connect all living beings. Against every rule of safari safety, Maggie Sullivan took her first step toward the trapped lion. Jake's hand instinctively moved to his rifle, his marine training screaming warnings about predators and elderly civilians, but something in the old woman's posture stopped him from intervening. She moved with the same deliberate calm she'd used approaching frightened children in her classroom, her voice dropping to the gentle murmur that had soothed 40 years' worth of scraped knees and broken hearts. "Easy now, big fellow," she whispered, her weathered hands empty and visible. "Let's see what we can do about this mess you've gotten yourself into." The massive lion's head lifted slightly, amber eyes focusing on her with an intensity that made Sarah's breath catch. Instead of the expected roar or charge, the animal made a sound almost like a sigh, as if recognizing something familiar in Maggie's tone. The 5 lionesses parted like curtains, creating a pathway that defied every documentary Sarah had ever watched about African predator behavior. Tommy's camera captured the impossible moment. An elderly American grandmother walking calmly through a pride of lions while they stood guard like sentinels. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted the focus, knowing he was witnessing something that would challenge everything wildlife experts thought they knew about lion psychology. Jake followed at a careful distance, his military assessment growing grimmer with each step. The trap was definitely Russian-made, probably designed for anti-personnel use before being repurposed for poaching. The spring mechanism would require tremendous pressure to release, far more than human strength could provide. He estimated the lion had been trapped for at least 72 hours based on the infection's progression, which meant they were already racing against septic shock. "This isn't random," he muttered, studying the trap's placement. The device had been carefully positioned along a game trail, baited with scent markers to attract a specific target. Someone had wanted to catch this particular lion, and Jake's combat experience told him that level of planning usually came with backup plans and multiple escape routes. Sarah knelt beside Maggie, who had somehow positioned herself close enough to the lion to see the full extent of his injuries. The trap's serrated teeth had penetrated deep into muscle and bone, and the surrounding tissue was an angry red that spoke of dangerous infection. But what struck her most was the lion's response to Maggie's presence. Instead of the pain-induced aggression she expected, he seemed almost grateful. "Ma'am," Jake said carefully, "we need to think about this logically. Even if we had the right equipment, removing that trap could cause arterial bleeding. And without proper medical facilities—" He didn't finish the sentence, but his implication was clear. Sometimes the kindest thing was to let nature take its course. Maggie's eyes flashed with the same fire that had once faced down unruly school boards and protective parents. "Young man, I've spent my entire life fighting for those who couldn't fight for themselves. I'm not about to stop now because the situation is difficult." She turned back to the lion, her voice softening again. "Harold always said the measure of a person isn't in what they do when it's easy, but what they do when it matters." Tommy lowered his camera, studying the scene with new eyes. The 5 lionesses hadn't just allowed Maggie to approach, they'd actively facilitated it. In 3 decades of wildlife photography, he'd never documented behavior like this. Lions were apex predators, not therapy animals. Yet something about this interaction challenged every assumption about the barriers between species. The mystery deepened when Sarah made a discovery that changed everything. While examining the trap more closely, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. "Jake," she called quietly, not wanting to alarm Maggie. "Look at this serial number. This trap is part of a series, military grade, distributed through black market weapons dealers." Jake's expression hardened as he recognized the implications. This wasn't the work of desperate local poachers trying to feed their families. Someone with serious resources and military connections had specifically targeted this lion. But why? And more importantly, were they still in the area, watching their rescue attempt? The group's dynamic shifted as they realized the full scope of what they'd stumbled into. This wasn't just a wildlife emergency, it was potentially a crime scene with international implications. Yet Maggie remained focused solely on the suffering animal before her hand gently stroking the lion's mane while she whispered words of comfort that somehow transcended language barriers. "We can't just leave him," she said firmly when Jake suggested waiting for proper authorities. "I wasn't there when Harold needed me most. I won't make that mistake again." The raw pain in her voice revealed depths of regret that Sarah, with her counselor's training, immediately recognized as unresolved grief. As if sensing the emotional stakes, the lion lifted his massive head and looked directly at Maggie. The moment stretched between them, human and predator locked in a communication that bypassed words and species. Tommy's camera clicked once, capturing an image that would later be described as showing the exact moment when 2 souls recognized each other across the divide of evolution. The 5 lionesses moved closer, forming a tighter circle around their small group. But instead of threat, their positioning suggested protection, as if they'd accepted these strange visitors as honorary Pride members. Jake's military training told him to be suspicious of anything that seemed too good to be true, but his heart recognized something authentic in the scene unfolding before him. "All right," he said finally, his voice heavy with the weight of command decisions he'd hoped never to make again. "We stay, but we do this smart, and we do it together. No one takes unnecessary risks, and at the first sign of real danger we evacuate." He looked at each of them in turn, waiting for nods of agreement. "And someone better figure out why our communications are being jammed, because this feels like more than coincidence." As storm clouds gathered on the horizon and the trapped lion's breathing grew more labored, 4 strangers committed themselves to a rescue mission that would test everything they thought they knew about courage, loyalty, and the price of doing what's right. As the afternoon sun climbed higher, casting harsh shadows across the Masai Mara, Maggie Sullivan settled into what could only be described as the most unconventional vigil of her 73 years. She'd positioned herself close enough to the trapped lion that she could see the rise and fall of his labored breathing. Yet somehow, the 5 lionesses seemed to accept her presence as natural. "You know, big fellow," she murmured, opening her water bottle and carefully dripping moisture onto the lion's dry tongue. "Harold used to say that stubbornness was both my greatest strength and my biggest weakness." The lion's amber eyes tracked her movements with an awareness that unnerved even Jake, who'd spent years observing African wildlife. This wasn't the dulled consciousness of a dying animal. This was active engagement, as if the massive predator understood that this elderly woman represented his best hope for survival. When Maggie began sharing stories about Harold, her voice taking on the rhythmic cadence she'd once used to calm frightened children, the lion's breathing seemed to stabilize slightly. "He proposed right here in Kenya, you know," she continued, pulling out the faded photograph that had traveled thousands of miles from Ohio. 1970. He was doing conservation research. Crazy young man with big dreams about saving the world's wildlife. I was a school teacher from Dayton who'd never been farther from home than Columbus. Her fingers traced Harold's young face in the picture. "He said this land had magic in it, that it could change a person if they let it." Jake worked methodically to establish communication with the outside world, his military training taking over as he tried every frequency on their satellite phone. The continued silence troubled him more than he let on. In 8 years of guiding safaris, he'd never experienced a complete communication blackout. Someone was actively jamming their signals, which meant someone knew exactly where they were and wanted them isolated. His hands, steady enough to handle wounded predators, developed a subtle tremor that reminded him uncomfortably of his worst days dealing with PTSD. "Emma called last week," he found himself saying to Sarah as they worked together to fashion a makeshift shelter from the vehicle's emergency supplies. "First time in 3 months. Said she saw something on social media about wildlife rangers in Kenya. Asked if I was happy here." He paused, adjusting a tarp against the growing wind. "I couldn't answer her. What kind of father doesn't know if he's happy?" Sarah recognized the pain in his voice. It matched the ache she carried every day since losing custody of Michael. "Happiness isn't a destination," she said quietly, her counselor training kicking in. "Sometimes it's just the absence of running away." She gestured toward Maggie, who was now singing softly to the lion, old hymns from her childhood that seemed to have a soothing effect on the entire pride. "Look at her. She's not running from anything anymore." The revelation came gradually, like pieces of a puzzle falling into place. While examining the trap more closely for potential removal techniques, Sarah noticed markings that made her dig through her equipment bag for an old interview notebook. "Jake," she called urgently, "I think I know who did this." Her hands shook as she flipped through pages of notes from a documentary project she'd abandoned months earlier. Viktor Petrov, Russian exile, former wildlife photographer turned poacher. The notebook contained details that made Jake's military instincts scream danger. Petrov wasn't just any poacher. He was a former Spetsnaz operator with a personal vendetta against African wildlife conservation. His 19-year-old son Dennis had been killed in a lion attack while volunteering at a Tanzanian wildlife sanctuary 2 years earlier. Since then, Victor had been systematically targeting the most successful conservation stories, turning rescued animals back into victims. He specifically hunts animals with rehabilitation histories, Sarah read from her notes. Says conservation efforts create false security that gets people killed. I interviewed him 6 months ago for a piece on the psychology of revenge. She looked up at the lion, a horrible understanding dawning. "This lion, I need to check something." While Sarah researched, Tommy documented everything with the obsessive dedication that had made him National Geographic's most requested photographer. But the work was taking its toll on his compromised heart. Each time he raised his heavy telephoto lens, pain shot through his chest, and his breathing became labored. He'd hidden his cardiac condition from the group, not wanting to become another burden in an already impossible situation. "You know," he said to Maggie during a brief rest, "my wife spent her last weeks in a hospital bed, surrounded by machines and sterile walls. She kept asking to see the sky one more time." His voice cracked slightly. "I should have brought her somewhere like this. Somewhere beautiful." Maggie reached over and patted his weathered hand with the same gentle touch she'd once used on homesick children. "Son, regret is just love with nowhere to go. Your wife knew you loved her. That's what mattered." She glanced at the lion, whose breathing had become more shallow as the day progressed. We can't change what's behind us, but we can choose what happens next. As evening approached, the group faced a horrible reality check. The lion's condition was deteriorating rapidly, and their improvised first aid efforts were clearly insufficient. Jake's assessment was grimly professional. Without proper veterinary intervention within the next 24 hours, septic shock would likely prove fatal. Yet none of them could bring themselves to voice what everyone was thinking, that they might be prolonging suffering rather than providing hope. The 5 lionesses seemed to understand the gravity of the situation better than the humans. They'd begun a behavior Sarah had never read about in any wildlife manual, taking turns touching their noses to the male's head in what could only be described as goodbye kisses. The sound they made, a low keening that seemed to come from their very souls, brought tears to even Jake's battle-hardened eyes. "This isn't right," Maggie said suddenly, her voice carrying a strength that surprised everyone. "I sat in a hospital hallway while Harold died because I was afraid to watch him suffer. I told myself I was being kind, giving him privacy." Her hands clenched into fists. "But he died alone because I was a coward. I won't let that happen again." The emotional confession created a shift in group dynamics that Sarah, with her counseling background, immediately recognized. Maggie's vulnerability gave the others permission to share their own regrets and fears. Jake talked about Jimmy Kowalski, his best friend who died in his arms in Afghanistan, while Jake was powerless to save him. Tommy spoke about the photographs he'd never taken of his wife during her final days because he couldn't bear to document her suffering. "I lost custody of my son because I chose my career over family dinners," Sarah admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Michael was 16 and needed his mother, but I was always somewhere else, trying to fix other people's relationships while mine fell apart." She looked at the lion, who seemed to be listening to their confessions with the patience of a priest. "Maybe that's why I'm here." Learning what it means to not give up on someone. As night fell over the Masai Mara, their little group huddled closer together, sharing warmth and stories while keeping vigil over a dying lion. The 5 lionesses arranged themselves in a protective circle, their amber eyes reflecting the stars as they maintained their own watch. Tommy captured photographs of the scene that would later be described as spiritual documentation, images that showed not just human compassion, but the deeper connections that bind all living creatures. The turning point came near midnight, when Jake's satellite phone finally crackled to life. The voice on the other end belonged to Dr. Patricia Williams, a veterinarian from Atlanta who worked with the Kenya Wildlife Service. "We've been trying to reach you for hours," she said. "Your location is being jammed, but we triangulated your position from Tommy's emergency beacon. We're mobilizing a rescue team, but the earliest we can reach you is tomorrow afternoon." "Will it be too late?" Jake asked, looking at the lion whose breathing had become increasingly erratic. Dr. Williams was quiet for a long moment. "I won't lie to you. The survival rate for trap injuries this severe with this much time elapsed, it's not good. But if you can keep him stable for another 12 hours, we'll give him every chance we can." As Jake relayed the conversation to the others, Maggie made a decision that would define the rest of her life. "Then we keep him stable," she said simply. "Whatever it takes." She settled back down beside the lion, her hand resting gently on his mane. "Harold always said the hardest battles are fought not with weapons, but with hope. We're not giving up on you, big fellow. Not tonight." The hours that followed tested everyone's resolve. The lion's fever spiked, causing delirium that made him struggle against the trap, worsening his injuries. Maggie sang every lullaby she could remember, her voice growing hoarse but never stopping. Jake used his military first aid training to monitor vital signs and manage pain as best he could with their limited supplies. Sarah coordinated with the incoming rescue team, while Tommy documented everything, knowing that this story, whatever its outcome, needed to be told. By dawn, all of them were exhausted, emotionally drained, and running on nothing but determination and the increasingly desperate hope that 12 hours of amateur veterinary care might be enough to save a life that had already touched theirs in ways they were only beginning to understand. The confrontation came with the harsh light of noon on their second day, when three figures emerged from the heat shimmer, like specters of violence. Viktor Petrov moved with the predatory grace of a man accustomed to hunting, his weathered face bearing scars that spoke of battles fought in places where mercy was a luxury. Behind him, two younger men carried military-grade rifles with the casual familiarity of professional soldiers, their eyes scanning the terrain with tactical precision that made Jake's combat instincts scream warnings. "Old woman?" Victor called out in heavily accented English, his voice carrying across the grassland like a death sentence. "You interfere with justice. That beast killed my boy." He gestured toward the trapped lion with a hatred so pure it seemed to radiate heat. "In Russia, we eliminate threats. We don't coddle them like household pets." Maggie struggled to her feet, her 73-year-old frame stiff from a night spent on the hard ground, but her voice carried the authority of 4 decades spent facing down unruly teenagers and hostile school board members. "Son, that animal is dying. What justice is there in torturing a creature that can't defend itself?" Her weathered hands remained visible and empty, but her posture conveyed the kind of quiet strength that had once convinced a generation of students that she would never abandon them. Jake positioned himself between the armed men and the others, his Marine training taking over as he assessed angles, cover, and potential escape routes. Victor's companions were professionals. Their weapons were clean and well-maintained, their positioning suggested military experience, and their eyes held the flat emptiness of men who'd killed before without losing sleep. But Jake also recognized something else in Victor's bearing, the same broken quality he'd seen in combat veterans who'd lost pieces of their souls on foreign battlefields. "Sir," Jake said carefully, using the tone he'd once employed to de-escalate situations in Afghan villages, "we're all here because we've lost someone. Let's not add to that count today." He kept his hands visible, knowing that any sudden movement could trigger a firefight none of them would survive. "Your son, tell me about him. What was his name?" The question seemed to catch Victor off guard, as if he'd expected resistance or pleading, but not genuine interest in his grief. "Dennis," he said, his voice cracking slightly on the name. 19 years old. He loved animals, volunteered at wildlife sanctuary in Tanzania, wanted to be veterinarian, help the creatures of Africa. The pain in his voice was raw and immediate, contradicting the cold efficiency of his tactical gear. Sarah stepped forward despite Jake's warning glance, her marriage counselor training recognizing the signs of unprocessed trauma. "Victor, I remember you now. We spoke 6 months ago about your documentary work. You showed me pictures of Denis. He was beautiful, so full of life." Her voice carried the professional warmth she'd once used to guide couples through their darkest moments. "What happened to him wasn't this lion's fault. You know that, don't you? You understand nothing." Victor's control finally cracked, revealing the volcanic grief underneath his calculated exterior. "My son believed your conservation lies, thought wild animals could be tamed, trusted, made safe. Lion tore his throat out while he was cleaning enclosure. Denis died believing these monsters could love him back." Tears streamed down his scarred cheeks, but his rifle never wavered from its target. Tommy continued photographing despite the danger, his journalist's instincts recognizing a story that transcended simple good versus evil narratives. Through his lens, he captured Victor's anguish, the protective stance of Jake's military bearing, Sarah's counselor calm, and Maggie's unwavering determination. But most importantly, he documented the 5 lionesses as they began to move, their hunting instincts triggered by the threat to their makeshift pride. The standoff escalated when Dr. Patricia Williams's helicopter appeared on the horizon, its medical rescue team representing salvation for the dying lion and potential witnesses to whatever Victor planned. One of his men raised his rifle toward the aircraft, but Jake's combat reflexes kicked in faster than conscious thought. "Don't," he said quietly, his own weapon materializing with the smooth efficiency of muscle memory. "That helicopter has medical personnel on board. Shooting it down makes you a terrorist, not a grieving father." "Lower your weapons," Victor commanded his men, but his own rifle remained trained on the lion. "Let them land. I want witnesses to see justice done properly." His smile held no warmth, only the grim satisfaction of a man who'd waited 2 years for this moment. "When I kill this animal, the world will understand that predators cannot be reformed, only eliminated." Maggie's voice cut through the tension like a blade forged from pure maternal authority. "Victor Petrov, you look at me when I'm talking to you." Something in her tone made even the hardened mercenaries pause, perhaps recognizing echoes of their own grandmother's voices. "I lost my Harold 2 years ago to cancer. Watched him waste away for 8 months, couldn't do a damn thing to save him. You think killing this lion brings Denise back?" "It prevents other sons from dying," Victor replied, but his conviction wavered slightly under Maggie's steady gaze. "Bullshit," Maggie said with the blunt honesty of someone who'd taught school for 40 years and had no patience for self-deception. "This is about your guilt, not Dennis's memory. You sent your boy to Africa thinking it would make a man of him, and now you can't live with the consequences." Her words hit Victor like physical blows, stripping away layers of justification to expose the raw wound underneath. The helicopter landed with a roar of rotor wash that sent dust swirling across the scene, and Dr. Williams emerged with her veterinary team, immediately assessing the bizarre tableau before them. A dying lion, 5 protective lionesses, an elderly woman who refused to move, a former Marine holding armed poachers at bay, and enough emotional dynamite to level a city block. "Step away from the animal," Dr. Williams commanded with the authority of someone accustomed to emergency situations. "We have maybe an hour before septic shock makes surgery impossible." She looked at Victor's rifle, then at Jake's defensive position. "Gentlemen, I don't care about your personal drama. That lion dies if we waste time on theatrics." Victor's internal struggle played out across his scarred features as he watched the veterinary team prepare their equipment. For 2 years he'd planned this moment, traveled thousands of miles to exact revenge on the species that had killed his son. But faced with the reality of preventing a medical rescue, something in his soldier's heart rebelled against becoming the villain in someone else's story. "My son loved these animals," he said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else. "Denny would hate what I've become." The rifle in his hands seemed to weigh 1,000 pounds as understanding dawned. "He would hate me for this." The moment of decision arrived when the lion suddenly convulsed, his massive body struggling against the trap's cruel grip as his fever spiked dangerously. Maggie immediately moved to comfort him, her hands gentle on his mane while she whispered words of encouragement. The 5 lionesses pressed closer, their keening calls of distress echoing across the grassland like a funeral dirge. "Please," Sarah said to Victor, her voice breaking with emotion. "Your son studied to save animals like this. Honor his memory by letting us try." She gestured toward the dying lion and the elderly woman who refused to abandon him. "Dennis would have been here with us, trying to help. You know he would." Victor's rifle slowly lowered as 20 years of military discipline warred with 2 years of grief-fueled rage. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the hollow sound of a man recognizing his own moral failure. "I sabotaged your radio equipment. I wanted you isolated, helpless." He looked at his 2 companions who waited for orders with the patience of professional soldiers. "Stand down. We're not killers today." Dr. Williams didn't waste time on gratitude or recriminations. "If you want to honor your son's memory," she told Victor as her team prepared surgical equipment, "then help us save this lion's life. I could use someone with steady hands and military medical training." She looked him directly in the eyes. "Your choice, Mr. Petrov. Be the father Denis would have been proud of, or be the man his death made you." The surgery began under the blazing African sun, with Victor Petrov, former hunter, grieving father, and would-be executioner, working alongside the veterinary team to save the life he'd traveled so far to take. The surgery lasted 4 grueling hours under the merciless African sun, with Dr. Williams working alongside Victor's surprisingly skilled hands to remove the military-grade trap that had nearly claimed the lion's life. But as evening approached and storm clouds gathered on the horizon, their hard-fought victory began to unravel with terrifying speed. The lion's vital signs, stable throughout the procedure, suddenly crashed as his body went into septic shock from the days-old infection that had spread through his bloodstream like poison. "He's not responding," Dr. Williams said grimly, checking the monitors that showed his heart rate climbing dangerously while his blood pressure plummeted. "The infection has gone systemic. Even with the trap removed, his body can't fight this level of toxicity." She looked up at the group of faces surrounding the makeshift surgical table, each one reflecting the same desperate hope that was about to be crushed. "I'm sorry. We did everything we could, but sometimes the damage is just too extensive." Maggie refused to accept the death sentence, her weathered hands stroking the lion's mane with the same gentle persistence she'd shown for 3 days. "No," she whispered, her voice carrying the stubborn determination that had once convinced skeptical school boards to fund programs for disadvantaged children. "He's fought too hard to give up now. We all have." But even as she spoke, the lion's breathing became increasingly labored, his massive chest rising and falling with the irregular rhythm of a failing heart. The 5 lionesses seemed to understand what the medical equipment confirmed. They began the heartbreaking ritual Sarah had witnessed once before during her research, forming a circle around their dying king while releasing low, keening calls that sounded like grief given voice. The sound cut through everyone present, a primal expression of loss that transcended species barriers and spoke directly to the human heart's capacity for empathy. Tommy struggled to document the scene through vision blurred by unexpected tears, his camera capturing what would later be described as some of the most emotionally powerful wildlife photography ever published. But the effort cost him dearly. The stress and physical exertion of the past 3 days had pushed his compromised heart beyond its limits. He collapsed suddenly, clutching his chest as cardiac arrhythmia sent shooting pains down his left arm. "Tommy!" Sarah cried, rushing to his side as the photographer crumpled to the ground. Dr. Williams immediately shifted her attention from the dying lion to the unconscious human, her medical training prioritizing the patient she could still save. "His pulse is erratic," she reported, checking vital signs with practiced efficiency. "He needs immediate cardiac care, but our helicopter can only take 1 critical patient." The impossible choice crystallized in that moment with brutal clarity. Save the dying photographer who'd documented their entire journey, or continue fighting for the lion who'd already received the best medical care possible. Jake's military training screamed at him to prioritize human life, but Maggie's voice cut through his tactical assessment with the moral authority of someone who'd spent her lifetime making difficult decisions about those in her care. "Take Tommy," she said firmly, her hand never leaving the lion's mane. "He has grandchildren who need him, a career's worth of stories still to tell. This beautiful creature has given us everything he had to give." Her voice broke slightly, but her resolve remained unshakable. "I'll stay with him." Nobody should die alone. Victor, who had worked tirelessly to save the life he'd once planned to take, found himself caught between redemption and fresh guilt. "This is my fault," he said quietly, watching the monitors flatline one by one. "If I hadn't set those traps, hadn't wanted revenge so badly." His scarred hands shook as he realized that his quest for justice had created exactly the kind of senseless loss he'd originally sought to prevent. As the medical helicopter lifted off with Tommy's unconscious form, darkness fell over the Masai Mara with unusual speed. The approaching storm system brought with it violent winds that bent the acacia trees and sent dust devils spiraling across the grassland. But the weather seemed insignificant compared to the tragedy unfolding in their makeshift medical station, where a magnificent creature was losing his battle against infection and time. Jake found himself thinking about Jimmy Kowalski, his best friend who'd died in his arms during their final deployment in Afghanistan. The helplessness he felt watching the lion slip away brought back every detail of that horrible day: the IED explosion, Jimmy's labored breathing, the desperate attempts at field medicine that had ultimately proven futile. "I couldn't save him either," he whispered to Sarah, his voice carrying 20 years of survivor's guilt. Dr. Williams made the difficult decision to administer a massive dose of antibiotics as a last resort, knowing it could either shock the lion's system back to stability or accelerate his death. "This is beyond veterinary science now," she admitted to the group. "We're in the realm of miracles, and I stopped believing in those after my 3rd year of practice." But even as she spoke the words, something in the lion's response to Maggie's constant whispers of encouragement made her wonder if healing involved more than just medical intervention. Maggie began talking to the lion about Harold, sharing memories that had sustained her through 2 years of widowhood and growing confusion as early-stage dementia slowly stole her past. "He would have loved you," she told the dying animal, her voice barely audible above the rising wind. "Harold always said that courage wasn't about being fearless. It was about being afraid but doing what's right anyway. You've been so brave, fighting this infection, trusting us to help." The breaking point came near midnight when the lion's breathing stopped entirely for nearly 30 seconds. The 5 lionesses released a collective wail that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth, while Maggie pressed her face against the lion's mane and sobbed with the accumulated grief of losing Harold, facing her own mortality, and watching another magnificent creature slip away despite everyone's best efforts. Sarah found herself praying for the first time since her divorce, not to any specific deity, but to whatever force in the universe might be listening to the desperate pleas of broken hearts trying to hold on to hope. Victor knelt beside his former target, his hand resting on the lion's flank as he whispered what sounded like apologies in Russian, perhaps to his son, perhaps to the animal he'd nearly killed, perhaps to himself, for the man he'd become in grief's aftermath. As the storm finally broke overhead, sending torrential rain across the drought-stricken grassland, 4 humans and 5 lionesses maintained their vigil around a dying king, their shared grief creating a bond that would outlast whatever came next. In that moment, surrounded by the raw power of an African thunderstorm, they learned that some battles are lost, not because the fighters lack courage, but because healing requires more than human determination can provide. The lion's final breath came with the dawn, peaceful and quiet after days of struggle, while Maggie's weathered hand rested gently on his mane and the 5 lionesses sang their ancient song of farewell to the king who had protected them until his very last heartbeat. The morning sun painted the Masai Mara in shades of gold and crimson, but the beauty felt obscene in the face of their devastating loss. Jake knelt beside the lion's still form, his combat medic training confirming what everyone already knew. The magnificent creature who had touched their lives so profoundly was gone. The 5 lionesses had fallen silent, their grieving calls replaced by a heavy quiet that seemed to press down on the grassland like a physical weight. But as Maggie continued stroking the lion's mane, something impossible began to happen. Sarah noticed it first, a barely perceptible rise and fall of the massive chest that she initially dismissed as wishful thinking. Then Dr. Williams, who had been packing her equipment with the grim efficiency of someone accustomed to losing patience, suddenly froze and reached for her stethoscope. "That's not possible," she whispered, pressing the medical instrument against the lion's chest. Her eyes widened as she heard what sounded like the faintest whisper of a heartbeat, so weak it barely registered on her equipment but unmistakably present. "I checked for vital signs 20 minutes ago. There was nothing." She looked up at the group with the expression of someone whose understanding of medical science had just been fundamentally challenged. The lion's amber eyes flickered open, focusing with obvious effort on Maggie's weathered face. The sound he made was barely audible, not a roar or growl, but something closer to a sigh of recognition. His massive head moved slightly, just enough to press more firmly against Maggie's gentle touch, as if drawing strength from her unwavering presence. "Well, I'll be damned," Victor breathed, his voice carrying wonder instead of his usual bitter edge. After 2 years of seeing the world through the lens of loss and revenge, witnessing this impossible recovery felt like watching his son's spirit work through the very creatures he'd died trying to protect. Dennis would have called this a miracle. He always believed animals had souls, just like people. Dr. Williams worked quickly to re-establish IV fluids and monitor the lion's returning vital signs, her professional skepticism warring with the evidence before her eyes. "Medically speaking, this shouldn't be happening," she admitted, watching heart rate and blood pressure readings that, while still dangerously low, showed steady improvement. "The septic shock should have caused irreversible organ damage. Yet somehow, his body is responding to treatment that failed completely just hours ago." Jake found himself thinking about combat situations where soldiers had survived injuries that should have been fatal, sustained by nothing more than the determination to see their families again. "Maybe he had something to live for that we didn't understand," he suggested, watching the 5 lionesses press closer to their recovering king. Their behavior had changed from mourning to something that could only be described as celebration, soft vocalizations and gentle nuzzling that spoke of joy beyond human comprehension. The first major revelation came when Sarah made a discovery that recontextualized everything they thought they knew about their situation. While organizing the medical equipment, she found a leather journal that had fallen from Victor's pack during the night's chaos. The pages, written in a mixture of English and Russian, contained detailed observations about lion behavior that read more like scientific research than the ravings of a grief-stricken father. "Victor!" she called, holding up the journal with hands that trembled slightly. "This isn't a hunting log. These are behavioral studies, conservation notes." She flipped through pages filled with detailed sketches of lions, habitat maps, and what appeared to be population tracking data. "You're not just a poacher. You're a wildlife researcher, just like your son was." Victor's face crumpled as his carefully constructed persona finally collapsed completely. "I was a photographer first, then researcher when Denis showed interest in conservation work," he admitted, his accent thickening with emotion. We planned to work together, father and son, documenting African wildlife for Russian Geographic Society. After he died, I couldn't bear to continue the work we'd shared. He gestured toward the recovering lion. I convinced myself that killing predators would prevent other families from suffering our loss. But really, I was just destroying everything Denise loved because I couldn't handle my grief. The second revelation came from Maggie herself, whose confusion seemed to clear dramatically as the lion's condition improved. "Jake," she said suddenly, her voice carrying a clarity that had been absent for days. "Do you remember your grandmother, Maggie Morrison? The one who used to send you birthday cards with pictures of African animals?" She studied his face with the intensity of someone struggling to grasp a memory that felt just out of reach. Jake's world tilted as understanding crashed over him like a physical blow. "Grandma Maggie died when I was 12. He said slowly, his military bearing cracking under the weight of impossible recognition. "She was married to Grandpa Harold. They fought with my dad about something, family business, inheritance, I never knew what. Dad changed our last name from Morrison to Morrison when they disowned us. Your father was my Harold's son," Maggie whispered, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "We lost touch during that terrible fight about Harold's will. He left everything to wildlife conservation instead of family." She reached out with shaking hands to touch Jake's face. "You have your grandfather's eyes. I came to Kenya with his ashes, following his letters about our grandson who'd become a wildlife ranger. Harold wrote about you before he died, said you were lost, but could be found in the place where it all began." The emotional revelation hit Jake like an IED explosion, shattering his carefully constructed emotional defenses. The grandmother he'd mourned as a child sat before him, having traveled halfway around the world to find him while battling her own failing memory. The irony was devastating. They'd spent 3 days saving a lion's life while failing to recognize their own family connection. Dr. Williams documented the lion's continued recovery with the fascination of someone witnessing medical history. "His infection markers are dropping rapidly," she reported, checking blood samples that defied everything she'd learned in veterinary school. "Somehow, his immune system has rallied in a way I've never seen before. If I didn't have the before and after lab results, I'd never believe this was the same animal." The third revelation came from an unexpected source: Tommy's photographic equipment, which Sarah had been organizing while waiting for news about his cardiac procedure. The images captured on his cameras told a story none of them had fully understood while living through it. The lion's behavioral responses to Maggie weren't random. They followed patterns that wildlife behaviorists had documented in cases where animals formed interspecies bonds with humans who'd shown them consistent kindness. "Look at this sequence," Sarah said, showing the others photographs from their first day together. "The lion isn't just tolerating Maggie's presence, he's actively seeking comfort from her. See how he positions himself to maintain contact? This is attachment behavior, the kind researchers have only documented in long-term rehabilitation cases." Victor studied the images with the trained eye of someone who'd spent decades documenting animal behavior. "This lion has been around humans before," he realized, pointing to subtle body language cues that spoke of familiarity rather than wild instinct. "Look at his reaction to medical equipment, the way he allows handling. He's been in rehabilitation, probably as a cub." The final piece of the puzzle emerged when Dr. Williams received a radio call from the Kenya Wildlife Service. "That lion is called Simba wa Dahabu, the golden lion," she reported, her voice carrying amazement. "He's famous among conservationists, rescued from an illegal circus operation 5 years ago, successfully rehabilitated and released. He's saved multiple human lives since then, including 3 Maasai children who were attacked by hyenas." As the full scope of their interconnected stories became clear, The grieving grandmother searching for her lost grandson, the revenge-seeking father confronting his own moral failure, the dying lion who'd learned to trust humans through kindness. Each member of their unlikely group began to understand that they'd been brought together by something far more profound than coincidence. In the heart of Africa, surrounded by the ancient rhythms of life and death, they'd discovered that healing sometimes requires the courage to love again, even after devastating loss. 4 months later, Maggie Sullivan Morrison sat in her wheelchair on the wooden deck of the Simba wa Dahabu Wildlife Lodge, watching the golden grasslands of the Masai Mara stretch toward infinity under the African sunset. The lodge had been built with funds from the viral #Lion Grandmother campaign, which had raised over $2.3 million in just 6 weeks after Tommy's photographs captured the world's imagination. Her weathered hands, though shakier now as the dementia progressed, still held the same gentle strength that had comforted a dying lion and revealed a family connection that neither time nor hurt feelings could truly sever. Jake approached from the main lodge building, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the contented expression of a man who'd finally found his place in the world. His promotion to Chief Wildlife Conservation Officer had come with the recognition that his military training, combined with his newfound family connections, made him uniquely qualified to bridge the gap between conservation efforts and community needs. "Emma's flight lands in Nairobi tomorrow morning," he said, settling into the chair beside his grandmother's wheelchair. "She's excited to meet you properly when you're having one of your good days." The relationship between grandmother and grandson had deepened during Maggie's extended stay in Kenya, though both of them knew their time together was limited. Her lucid moments came less frequently now, but when her mind was clear, the connection between them felt as natural as if they'd never been separated by family feuds and stubborn pride. "Your grandfather would be so proud," she said, her voice carrying the clarity that still emerged during evening hours. Harold always believed that conservation work was really about preserving love for the land, for the animals, for future generations who deserve to inherit beauty. The sound of approaching vehicles announced the arrival of their evening visitors, a routine that had developed organically over the past month. Victor Petrov emerged from the lead Land Cruiser, his transformation from vengeful hunter to dedicated conservationist still startling to witness. The Denis Memorial Wildlife Foundation had become one of East Africa's most effective anti-poaching organizations, employing former hunters and training them to protect the animals they'd once stalked. The evening patrol found 2 more snares near the river, he reported, his Russian accent softened by months of working alongside local Maasai guides. "We removed them and identified the poacher. He's willing to join our employment program instead of facing prosecution." Sarah climbed out of the second vehicle, her face glowing with the satisfaction of meaningful work. Her transition from marriage counselor to wildlife behavioral specialist had been unexpected but natural, her understanding of relationship dynamics proving invaluable in managing both human and animal interactions. "I had a video call with Michael today," she announced, unable to suppress her smile. "He's planning to spend his gap year here, helping with the research programs. Says he wants to understand what made his mother choose animals over family." And then he laughed, so I know he's not angry anymore. The real magic began as the sun touched the horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. Right on schedule, the familiar pride appeared at the edge of the grassland, moving with the unhurried confidence of apex predators who knew they were safe in this sanctuary. Simba wa Dahabu led the procession, his golden mane now fully restored to its former magnificence, showing only the faintest limp from his ordeal with the trap. The 5 lionesses flanked him protectively, but their wariness had evolved into something closer to recognition when they spotted the human gathering on the lodge deck. "There he is," Maggie whispered, her eyes brightening with the joy that came whenever she saw the lion whose life had become so intertwined with her own. Even in her declining mental state, she never failed to recognize Simba wa Dahabu, as if their bond had been forged at a level deeper than conscious memory. "Hello, beautiful boy. Have you come to say good night?" The lion's response never failed to move everyone present. Instead of the casual acknowledgement typical of wild predators, Simba wa Dahabu would approach the deck and sit just close enough to maintain eye contact with Maggie. His vocalizations weren't the territorial roars of dominance but softer sounds that wildlife behaviorists had documented as expressions of contentment and recognition. The 5 lionesses would arrange themselves in their familiar protective circle, but now the formation included the lodge deck, as if the humans had been officially adopted into their pride structure. Tommy emerged from the lodge's photography studio, moving carefully but steadily as he recovered from his cardiac episode and subsequent surgery. The Pulitzer Prize he'd won for his lion rescue series sat on the mantel inside. But his current work documenting the ongoing relationships between the rescued animals and their human families meant more to him than any professional recognition. "The sunset shots from yesterday are ready," he announced, showing them images that captured not just wildlife, but the profound connections that had formed between species. National Geographic wants to do a follow-up story. The Lion Grandmother, 1 year later. As darkness settled over the Masai Mara, the evening ritual reached its emotional climax. Maggie would slowly wheel her chair to the edge of the deck, close enough for Simba wa Dahabu to approach if he chose. The lion, as if understanding her limitations, would rise and pad forward until they were separated by only a few feet of African air. In those moments, the boundaries between human and animal seemed to dissolve, leaving only 2 souls who had helped save each other when salvation appeared impossible. "Harold," Maggie whispered, speaking to the wooden box of ashes that sat beside her chair, "we kept our promise. We came back to Kenya, and we found our family." Her words carried the poignant mixture of lucidity and confusion that characterized her current state, but the emotional truth behind them remained crystal clear. "Our grandson is safe, the lions are protected, and love won. Love always wins, doesn't it?" Jake wiped away tears he wasn't ashamed to shed, watching his grandmother commune with the magnificent creature whose rescue had revealed connections none of them had known existed. The family feuds that had separated them for decades seemed petty now, overwhelmed by the recognition that blood ties and chosen families could coexist in ways that honored both the past and the future. "Emma's bringing her boyfriend," he told Maggie, knowing she'd want to know about potential new additions to their restored family. "She says she wants him to meet the woman who taught her father that courage comes in all sizes." Victor approached the group carrying a leather journal, not the hunting log from their first encounter, but a new research notebook filled with observations about interspecies bonding and conservation psychology. "I received news from Moscow," he announced quietly. "Russian Geographic Society wants to fund a documentary about Denise's conservation work, focusing on his belief that humans and wildlife can coexist peacefully. They want to call it The Lion's Heart, using our story as proof that healing is possible even after terrible loss." Sarah documented the evening's interactions with the scientific precision that had made her research invaluable to wildlife behaviorists worldwide. But beyond the data about animal psychology and human-wildlife relationships, she found herself capturing something harder to quantify: the way broken hearts could heal when they found purpose larger than their own pain. "Dr. Williams called this afternoon," she reported. "Simba wa Dahabu has become a father. 3 cubs, all healthy, all showing the same unusual tolerance for human presence that their father demonstrates." As the stars emerged over the African grassland, painting the sky with ancient light, Their unlikely family gathered around Maggie's wheelchair while the lion pride settled into their evening rest just beyond the lodge's boundaries. The future remained uncertain. Maggie's condition would continue to deteriorate, the cubs would need protection as they grew, and the work of conservation required constant vigilance against those who saw wildlife as commodities rather than companions. But in that moment, surrounded by the people and animals whose lives had become inextricably connected through shared trauma and mutual rescue, Maggie Sullivan Morrison felt the deep satisfaction of someone who had lived fully, loved completely, and left the world a little better than she'd found it. The lion's gentle breathing provided a natural rhythm to the African night, a heartbeat that would continue long after her own had stopped, carrying forward the legacy of an Ohio grandmother who'd proven that courage knows no boundaries and love requires no translation. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight belonged to gratitude, to family both biological and chosen, and to the quiet miracle of lives intersecting exactly when they needed each other most. At 73, Maggie Sullivan thought her best days were behind her. Widowed, facing dementia, watching her family drift apart like leaves in autumn wind. Sound familiar? How many of us have felt that crushing weight of irrelevance, wondering if we still matter in a world that seems to worship youth? But in the golden grasslands of Kenya, this retired schoolteacher from Dayton discovered something remarkable. Our greatest adventures don't end at retirement. They're just beginning. When Maggie knelt beside that dying lion, she wasn't just saving an animal. She was reclaiming her purpose, rebuilding her family, and proving that courage has no expiration date. Her story reminds us that it's never too late to heal old wounds, forge new connections, or discover that the love we give comes back to us in ways we never imagined. Whether it's reconnecting with estranged grandchildren, finding meaning in unexpected places, or simply refusing to let age define our limitations, Maggie's journey shows us that our final chapters can be our most beautiful ones. The lion survived because someone refused to give up on him, just like our dreams survive when we refuse to give up on ourselves. What dream have you given up on that might still be waiting for you? Have you ever experienced an unexpected moment that completely changed your perspective on aging? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.